The return of the black box. The revisionist idea of the Hijaz as a barbarian's no man's land that couldn't produce Islam has made a comeback. In a review of Patricia Crona's Roman Provincial and Islamic Law, The Origins of Islamic Patronate, Wet al-Halak once noted a theme running through the eminent historian's controversial early work, from Hagerism to slave on horses to Meccan trade and the rise of Islam. The notion of a stark civilizational and identitarian divide between the settled people of the Levant and Mesopotamia on the one hand, and Bedouin communities of the Arabian Peninsula on the other. In these studies, the Fertile Crescent belongs typologically to the ancient world of Greece and Rome, while the southern regions are assumed to be a barbarian no man's land. So when the culturally deprived inhabitants of the desert conquered the northern areas, they could only imitate and adapt the high culture of their subjects, including the system of clientage or wallet and manumission that Crona argues came from Roman provincial law. But as Halak demonstrated, Crona was ignoring the, quote, constant state of flux between North and South in the centuries before the Islamic era, preferring instead a vision of discrete geographic zones and ethnic groups that scholars of the Roman Byzantine Near East had already begun to overturn. Crona's wider point was a historical comparison of nomadic or semi-nomadic societies who were able to use their domination of the Eurasian desert and steppe zones to launch major assaults on settled centers of civilization. She was thinking of the Gothic invasions that brought down Rome and the later Mongol invasions. But while in terms of the broad lines of human history she was onto something, further developed in her study pre-industrial societies, when you get down to the details, the model becomes misleading. Halak was able to point to a raft of studies that have established how the Roman and Byzantine Levant in particular was full of Arabic-speaking communities, both settled and migratory, retaining their own customs and language, yet living symbiotically with the Syriac or Aramaic speakers of most settled towns and villages. The polities in question, which were often linguistically hybrid in nature, included the Palmyran state of Queen Zenobia, as well as the Nabatean territories, where papyrus discoveries from 1993 show that Arabic speakers were still resident in Petra in the late 500s, as well as the Ghassanid tribal confederation based at Al-Jabia in the Hauran region overlooking the Golan in southwest Syria. In the immediate pre-Islamic period, Christianity was widespread among these Levantine communities, mainly through two churches, the Greek language Chalcedonian Rite of Constantinople and the West Syriac Jacobite Rite of the Levant, both of which competed with the Syriac Mesopotamian Church of the East, which was under Sasanian patronage. By the time Crona passed in 2015, Islamic historians had managed to catch up with these ideas spreading in other historical fields. The notion of Islam as a late antiquity phenomenon had taken hold. In simple terms, what this means is that Islam should be understood as emerging from the intellectual world of late antiquity, or to put a more colloquial spin on it, as in conversation with those religious, social, legal, and political systems. But the crucial question is where contact between these ideas and the Hijazi Islamic movement took place. While the earlier Patricia Crona and other revisionist scholars would have said this meeting occurred in the Levant during the era of the conquests when they suspected much of the Quran was composed, now the trend was to see the Levant as having come to the peninsula. Indeed, it has been popular to argue that the culture of the Fertile Crescent, especially its Christian texts and languages, had permeated the peninsula by the time of the conquests, an idea to which many Islamic historians were for long oddly resistant. What this would mean is that the various Christian churches were competing for souls inside the peninsula from the centers they had established in Yemen and the Gulf littoral. Crona was among the revisionists who changed their thinking on a range of issues related to the fundamental question of the Islamic tradition's reliability, due to the fact that its version of history was written down over a century after the events in question, and thus reflects the changing worldview of a new empire and culture. Among the issues she rethought is the notion of Arabia as an inscrutable black box. Indeed, she famously wrote in a series of open access web articles published from 2007 to 2009, quote, "Arabia seems to have been a much more developed place than most Islamicists, myself included, had ever suspected, not just in the north and south, but also in the middle." There are still some outliers. Independent researcher Dan Gibson thinks Muhammad lived in Petra, not Mecca. But among serious Islamic scholars, the most prolific has been Stephen Shoemaker. And I want to take a look at some of his writing here. I should state at the outset that I'm a fan of Shoemaker's work, in the sense that he's done meticulous research and he's challenging newly forming conventions. But there's an underlying theme to his work that really needs interrogation. A professor at the University of Oregon, Shoemaker began as a historian of Near Eastern Christianity, with early research such as the ancient traditions of the Virgin Mary's Dormition and Assumption that looked at Christian apocryphal literature related to Mary. One of his first publications in the Islamic field concerned an obscure Byzantine church that once existed between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, the Church of the Katisma of the Theotokos, or Church of the Seat of the God-bearer, i.e. Mary. Uncovered during excavations in 1997, the church contains liturgical and iconographic traditions regarding Christ's nativity that appear to explain Quran Surah 19, verses 22 to 27, specifically the story of Mary resting under a date palm and eating from it during the flight to Egypt. Shoemaker's key argument is that Muhammad could not have encountered these traditions during his lifetime in the Hijaz, meaning the Red Sea coast and mountain region that stretches down to Asir. So these verses must have been composed during the conquests, and Jerusalem fell around 637 to 638. After publishing his article in 2003, Shoemaker went on to author a series of studies looking at non-Muslim sources of the early Islamic era, which give the impression that the conquest began as a jihadist apocalyptic movement promising its diverse followers an Abrahamic right to rule Palestine, the divine right. His latest book, Creating the Quran, a Historical Critical Study, is a tour de force of insistent revisionism. Radiocarbon dating of a series of early Quranic fragments since 2009 has helped create a new scholarly consensus that the Quranic text we have today was finalized during the reign of Uthman, from 644 to 656, just as the Islamic tradition said it was. But Shoemaker comes up with many valid criticisms of radiocarbon dating to argue that the text circulated orally until it was finally gathered and edited as part of an imperial codification project under Abdul Malik, who ruled later 685 to 705, and who was content to promulgate the codified text as Uthman's work, since Uthman was his kinsman amongst the early Islamic rulers. Indeed, it's under Abdul Malik that the conquest society becomes recognizably Islamic. Coins, buildings, milestones, and documents from his era show that it was at this time, following his reassertion of Umayyad family rule after a civil war, that the state publicly promulgated terminologies such as Caliph, Islam, and Muslim for the first time, whereas previously emigrants, muhajirun, and believers, mu'minun, were the apparent preferred self-designations. The language of administration shifted from Greek to Arabic. The Dome of the Rock, which Abdul Malik completed in Jerusalem in 692, promotes a public definition of what this Muslim faith and identity involved by means of its inner and outer wall inscriptions containing Quranic statements of faith and declarations that Christ was a messenger of God, not his son. Rebels had challenged the Umayyad right to rule through a nativist discourse that impugned Umayyad piety, claiming to be the true heirs of Muhammad through acts such as issuing coins for the first time with his name and seizing the Meccan pilgrimage site as a rebel stronghold. During 19 years in power, the earlier Umayyad ruler Muawiyah had drawn close to the majority Christians after moving the seat of government from Medina to Damascus, holding his coronation in Jerusalem and then praying the same day at Golgotha and Gethsemane, if the 7th century Maronite Chronicle is to be believed. And he also drew Christians into his bureaucracy and army. By contrast, Abdul Malik drew clear boundaries and stamped his regime with an unambiguously Islamic imprint. However, one of the key problems with Shoemaker's argument is his insistence that the Quran's late antique character cannot have resulted from origins in a Hijazi setting. It does not seem possible, he says, for the region to have been steeped in the rich cultural heritage of the late ancient Roman and Sasanian worlds. Reasons for this, in his telling, include Hijazi illiteracy and lack of education, only a few references to Medina in pre-Islamic sources and none to Mecca, lack of evidence that either town was on the ancient world's trade routes, the Quran's sole and ambiguous reference to Mecca as Bakka, lack of evidence that Quranic Arabic is a product of the Hijaz, and frequent references to non-Hijazi features such as grain, grapes, olives, date palms, pomegranates, seafaring, and fishing, as well as sheep, goats, cows, oxen, camels, mules, donkeys, and horses. How, he asks, is any of this compatible with Mecca and Medina in the Hijaz? Since Mecca and Medina both sit inland, quote, some 100 to 200 kilometers from the Red Sea respectively in the middle of a vast barren desert, he claims these references to the civilized world could not possibly have resonated with the Quran's audience. In short, Mecca, if it existed for Muhammad, was a backwater. There was no knowledge to be had in Mecca, at least of a non-Arabian variety, and its residents were incapable of traveling to acquire any. These arguments typify a kind of abstract approach to the culture and society in question that seems to me completely divorced from reality. In his own book, A Prophet Has Appeared, The Rise of Islam Through Christian and Jewish Eyes, Shoemaker notes the confirmation in early non-Muslim reports of Muhammad as a trader in the Levant, who became a learned man through his sojourns there. What makes it unlikely then that he or others from the deepest Hijaz wouldn't acquire knowledge about Christianity, its theology, and its disputes, or the wars of the Byzantines and Persians? And if Muhammad could travel to the Levant, why couldn't he spend time by the sea at Al-Shu'aibah, south of modern Jeddah, which functions fairly typically as the coastal center to the hinterland pilgrimage sites around Mecca? The port is mentioned by early Abbasid historians Al-Azraqi and Al-Faqihi as Mecca's coastline, though Krona too ignores this in her Meccan trade. What about the green mountains of Ta'if, further inland from Mecca, and Asir and Jazan to the immediate south? Those are not exactly the desiccated zones that Shoemaker describes in Mecca, but somehow he thinks residents of the Meccan Dust Bowl would never in their lives have thought of taking the weather elsewhere. But if the Hijazi Arabs knew nothing of the sea, why were they heading to Cyprus in naval raids organized by Muawiyah from 649 when he was governor of Syria? Arabia seems to be for Shoemaker another world, something close to the Barbarabia that Halak excoriated in Krona's early work. The idea that the various tribal, settled, and pastoral communities of the peninsula wouldn't have interacted with each other is ludicrous to anyone who knows them today. Firstly, anthropologists specializing in the Arabian Peninsula are well aware of the historical phenomenon of tribes moving from south to north. The pre-Islamic Hijazi poets such as Hassan bin Thabit, only some of whose material was produced later under false attribution, spent time at the Levantine court of the Ghassanids in Al-Jabiya. So even if Shoemaker can claim that, quote, although Christianity had literally encircled the central Hijaz by Muhammad's lifetime, there is no indication whatsoever of a Christian community in either Mecca or Medina, the point is there didn't have to be for Muhammad's religious community to develop their own take on Abrahamic monotheism. Shoemaker also over-relies on the dictum that lack of evidence is evidence of absence. Hatun al-Fassi touches on the lifeless semblance of history that this can lead to in her study of the Nabatean caravan trade that ran the length of the peninsula, titled Women in Pre-Islamic Arabia, Nabatea. Even if inscriptions haven't provided the proof that empirical maximalists demand to establish the centrality of the southern Hijaz for the early Islamic movement, experts in Arabian epigraphy have noted that monotheistic epithets such as Alilah and Rahman begin to appear the length and breadth of the peninsula throughout the 500s, attesting to a pre-Islamic shift in religiosity that is hard to disassociate from the apparent spread of the rival churches throughout the region. In short, the 1980s are calling and want their revisionist history back. Shoemaker doesn't go quite as far as those claiming that Mecca is Petra, a theory that would require rethinking the geographic origins of everyone in the Islamic tradition described genealogically as Qurayshi. But he leans heavily into some arguments that most scholars have been content to set aside. Shoemaker has certainly thrown down the gauntlet to the recent radiocarbon dating fetish in Quranic studies, and provides an alternative theory of how the text could have been finalized during Abdul Malik's caliphate. But he's also speaking to the question of whether the Hijaz or the Levant is the intellectual background for a fair chunk of the Quranic text, arguably the most pressing issue in the field at present. And on that score, the idea that the Hijaz could not produce people mobile enough to access knowledge from near or far seems incredibly naive. And those for whom this makes little sense need to push back.